Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Salam Aleichem. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the delegate and distinguished guests, I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be here representing the City Repair Organization of Portland, Oregon. And I want to express my thanks to the WIEF organization for the invitation and for seeing the merit in this important topic today. We are here to discuss the intersection of smart cities, sustainable urban planning, and holistic communities. My hope is that we have a vision underpinned by practical plans towards implementation. We have quite a distinguished panel to uplift these ideas that we'll be discussing. However, before I introduce them, a little on our topic. We are in an age where we're experiencing exponential population growth at the same time as the many ways we have been designing our communities and doing our business are pushing our apparent limits of our resources, causing environmental degradation from polluted waters, air, and soil to global climate change, which is beginning to impact lives across the globe. Benjamin Grant of the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Association said that the idea that there is a connection between the shape of cities and the patterns of settlement and their climate impact is so powerful that many other ideas can be sort of subsumed within that narrative. There are, of course, many organizations that have come to address these concerns: the LEED and the Green Building Council, the Livable Building Challenge, Net Zero Building Future. But these are buildings alone, and our panel is here looking at the bigger picture of urban planning and smart cities. My organization, City Repair, has built itself in response to the isolation resulting in modern American cities from the deployment of the Roman grid pattern that allows for rapid expansion of cities that is largely built to maximize economic output. We posit a solution to this modern isolation, high crime and drug rates, by repairing cities' neighborhoods by a sort of neighborhood revitalization. We take people through a multi-month process culminating in teaching them how to get to know their neighbors, what assets and value they have right in their own neighborhood, and giving them design tools that culminate in community art installation that the neighbors plan and create together as an expression of who they are and what is important to them in and about their neighborhood. We turn spaces into places. We have people from around the world come to join our annual event, the Village Building Convergence, of which I am the placemaking director, that is like a good old-fashioned barn raising, where the neighborhood comes together and builds something together, building a common story together. We are in the midst of a fundraising campaign to expand our capacity to serve the requests that we have coming in to support more communities to do this in their homes around the world. So I'm here representing the holistic end of livability. Each of our distinguished panelists will have 5 minutes to present and introduce their work and expertise. I want to thank you and thank them and start off by inviting Rob Adams to come to the podium. Rob is the Director of City Design, City of Melbourne and the Commonwealth of Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity of speaking to you this afternoon. What I'd like to talk to you about is how cities can, I think, improve themselves in the future. We know what the problem is. We can see it on the board there. There are 3.5 billion living in cities, and by the end, next 40 years, it'll go to 6.4. We need to build twice the urban capacity in the next 40 years. We are not going to do that by building the way we build traditionally. I'd like to take you back to when I was at university in the mid-60s. Cape Town University had 5,000 students. When all the universities were expanding, Cape Town could not expand. It was on the mountain surrounded. It asked itself a different question. How well are we using what we've already got? And what they found is that things like lecture theatres were being used for 17.5% of the time. What they did is they didn't expand, they re-timetabled. When I went back there 30, 40 years later, they had 15,000, almost 15,000 students on the same area, and they'd built hardly anything. What I'm going to tell you today is a story about doing more with less. The 7.5% city. Melbourne is going to grow from 4 to 8 million in the next 40 years. We looked at the capacity of the city and we decided on a way that you could go forward. If you jump up in a helicopter and look at our city, you can look around our railway stations, and around those railway stations we can accommodate 860,000 people. We've got many of those stations and they're well connected. If you look at the road-based public transport, the buses and the trams, we looked at the sensitivities, and we've got a fantastic system you can see there of bus and trams, interconnected. We looked at every block of land along those, and we took out the sensitivities. We took out things like special zones. We took out selected parcels. We actually selected the parcels along the tram network. We took out parks. We took out public uses. We actually took out places didn't have rear access so that we got good development without big black holes going to parking garages. We took out recently developed sites, heritage sites, and 50% of the heritage overlay areas. What that left us with was 34,000 sites that could be developed. And if you put a reasonable density on those sites, we could get 2.4 million people living immediately adjacent to that public system. The final, and it looked something like this. So you can see here, we have fantastically expensive infrastructure, but the buildings along them are not very good. So why could this not start to look a bit like this? Why could we not put the density along that without going higher than 8 stories? The proposition was this. If this was the city and these were the public transport routes, why could you not start expanding your density along there? Leave the spaces in between, leave the suburbs in between, and they can become the new green wedges. They can become where you collect the water, where you plant the trees, where you do solar voltaics. This would give us the opportunity to not only provide employment close to where people live, to get a walkable city, but to increase and double the population of our city by only using 7.5% of the land. Another experiment in this was when we started in 85, our city was one of the worst cities. We've now been voted for 4 years in a row the world's most livable cities. One of the strategies was we had to bring back a population. We did that by utilising the buildings that we already had. Australians didn't want to live in cities. So we put a program together when we got the crash of the property market in the late 80s, whereby we got people to reinvest in the buildings that were already there, to start to actually rebuild these and replan them as residential buildings. So you can see here an old office building had residential put through it and added to the top. This is what happened. So we start off in 1982, we had 600 odd dwelling units. Each of those red dots equals 5 units. 2002, sorry, that went too fast for me. 2002, there should be one slide in between, I don't know what's happened to it. We've now got 29,000 residential units in the central city. We also at the same time started to improve the amenity of the city, the public realm. We planted trees, and those are the trees we planted since 1993. Our parks and gardens are part of our signature. But with climate change, we found that we had the first 11-year drought in our history. It's no longer a drought, it's climate change. And the result is we were to lose 48% of our trees in the next 20 years. So we put in place a strategy that looked at the species, the age, and the drought that we had had. And you can see on the fifth line down, the 11 years there. And we put in place a strategy to try and cool our city. We know that by planting trees, you can cool a city by up to 4 degrees. So we put in place targets. We wanted to increase the canopy cover in the city from 22% to 40%. We wanted diversity, and we wanted healthy trees. We put in place an urban forest strategy where we actually Every single tree in our municipality now has a code. You can visit each of those trees, you can identify it by using your iPhone, you can find out how old it is, what health it is, how long it's going to last. You can even send it an email. And this tree responded to the email it was sent. So people have now engaged with the trees and it's become a public consultation process. This is what's happened to the water in our city. It's almost dropped by half. We've put in place projects to use the city as a catchment, to capture the water and to reuse it. We capture it straight off the street into the trees. We've built a lot of retaining tanks to capture it. This is a large one that actually produces 80% of the water for the park behind it. It's a 5 million litre tank. This is the tank being built. This is a tank underneath one of our streets, which has the rain garden now back above the street, which produces the water or purifies the water to go back into the gardens. And we've got the normal wetlands that you can get traditionally. We now collect 20% of the water that we need for our landscapes, and we save ourselves, just in the inner city, $650,000 a year on purchasing of water. We've started to actually strip back the asphalt. We've taken 45 hectares of asphalt out of the city and turned it over to pedestrians and parks. You can see here a 529 square metre traffic island is turned into a 5,000 square metre park. It would have cost us $14 million if we had to buy the land. It cost us $2 million because we took the road. And that's a strategy that we've put in place. You can see the park now is actually built within the area. Even our buildings, this building, the most sophisticated technology of this was the first 6-star Green Star building, commercial building in Australia. The most sophisticated technology is we open the windows at night. We have cool nights and hot days, so we use the thermal mass of the building to save us 20% of the energy. You can see the temperatures there, cool nights, hot days, and as I say, opening the windows is the technology. This is my final slide. Having done all that, we've increased the population, we've changed the nature of our infrastructure, we're using it in a different way. We've reduced the taxes from 13.5 cents to just over 4 cents. Why? We haven't had to build a whole lot of new infrastructure as the population's increased. One of the challenges for our cities is to use the stuff we've got a lot better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Rob reminds us and tells us how we can do more with less, revitalizing our cities. And next we have René de Graaf. He's a partner of the Office of Metropolitan Architecture from the Netherlands. Thank you. Please welcome.
Thank you. When preparing for this small contribution to the panel, I basically looked up when the term sustainability started to dominate our discourse. And as is often the case, this starts with a political imperative. And political imperatives are often rooted in disasters, or at least the prediction of imminent disasters. So this is disaster's most eloquent spokesman, actually on the left slide. Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth, who basically, of course, predicted the consequences of climate change. The consequences of climate change are most iconographically captured in this world map, a world map that after the 2-degree rise in temperature would look considerably different. I think it is interesting that this consequence of climate change in a way coincides with another inconvenient truth that we are facing as urban planners. The world is urbanizing. Much has been said about that. And the world is urbanizing at a very rapid pace. But what does it actually mean? It means that we are inhabiting an ever smaller percentage of the Earth's surface with an ever larger number of people. These are, in a way, the mega city regions of the future. These are the regions of the world that will matter demographically and economically if the trend of urbanization is taken to its ultimate conclusion somewhere by the middle of this century. Now, if you superimpose this on, in a way, Al Gore's map, there is an interesting effect on this, is that apparently all of us are flocking to the areas which are first to disappear once actually climate change takes a full effect. So it seems to be that urbanization is coinciding with an almost global suicide pact. I don't know what that means, but in a way, the combination of disasters might actually spur another type of action, hopefully. It actually means, more specifically, that if we want to avert this, we ought to fortify our city against the consequences of water to an extreme extent. And although this image may appear far-fetched, how far-fetched is it? This is a specific case. This is a prediction of Hurricane Sandy on the American news just on the eve of the storm. This is the storm approaching the American coast. This is the storm over the Statue of Liberty, and this is the morning after. Vast areas of the New York metropolitan areas were flooded. There was a major damage in terms of the economy because of oil refineries having to shut down, and probably the absolute worst thing that can happen in any American context, the stock exchange had to close with, you know, an associated loss, blah, 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 blah. We came in to this problem because we're Dutch, and the Dutch embody an interesting combination in terms of skills. They know a lot about water because our country, for most part, is below sea level. And the second thing is we hate spending money. We know most about water and hate spending money most. That is the combination of properties that made us relevant in this particular case. To fortify the American coast against a storm like Sandy would mean an immense, immense cost if one would fight the water all the way. What, in a way, the strategy here was to invent a situation that would work with nature where it could, and work against nature where it was absolutely necessary. So we made a risk analysis of the American coast in terms of probability of floods and the potential effect of floods when they would happen, and focused on a number of areas where we, in a way, applied strategies of water management. This is Hoboken, the birthplace of Frank Sinatra, entirely irrelevant. But anyway, it's a city that is actually in a floodplain. It's a city that for most part would be 2 meters underwater if nature would have its course. It was 2 meters underwater when nature in fact did have its course on the 23rd of October. And we in a way went at it with a combination of resisting the classical way of dealing with water, delaying the water, storing the water, and also discharging the water. So in a way, preventing disaster by allowing the water in and allowing the water out. Similarly to the last speaker, a big problem is that it's 90% hardscape. So also we introduced the green belt in a way to let the water in, let the water out. Plant that green belt as a new form of urbanism in that context. Those are the results. Meanwhile, of course, because of various actions, things look more hopeful after the storm. I would like to end by saying that, of course, this specific case doesn't stand on its own. This is a summary of all the climate anomalies that come about because of climate change on a global scale. And the last slide is, in a way, a slide of the associated costs. And it's clear that if we fight nature all the way, in the face of a problem we ourselves created, that the economic costs are going to spiral out of control very, very rapidly if we continue doing these things in the classical sense. And, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Reinier. Again, doing more with less and working with nature. Next, I'd like to invite to the podium Ramus Kent. He's a consultant with the Permaculture Research Institute and Permaculture Sustainability Consulting, originally from the United States of America, now residing in England, I believe.
Yes, England. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-'aliyyil 'azim. Assalamu alaikum. We learn from history that the existence of cities was made possible through the advent of agriculture approximately 7,000 years ago. These more densely populated centers were able to sustain themselves through the increased production of food crops per unit of area of land. It seems obvious that unless people have a way of feeding themselves adequately and are ensured access to a reliable source of enough clean, drinkable water, city living is simply not possible. So the development of cities and agriculture are intimately linked. In fact, the existence of cities is contingent on the establishment of agriculture. These innovations have been viewed by most as being hallmarks of human progress. That is, if we choose to look only at the favorable outcomes and ignore the flaws which accompany these historical phenomena. They aren't without their problems. In 1953, an American researcher with the U.S. Department of Agriculture named Dr. W.C. Loudermilk published a small book called Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years, detailing, quote, the record of agriculture in countries where the land had been under cultivation for hundreds, even thousands of years. His immediate mission was to find out if the experience of these older civilizations could help in solving the serious soil erosion and land use problems in the United States, which was struggling at the time with repairing the large-scale land degradation of the American Dust Bowl from the 1930s. He discovered that soil erosion, deforestation, overgrazing, neglect, and conflicts between herdsmen and cultivators had helped topple empires and wipe out entire civilizations. At the same time, he learned that careful stewardship of the Earth's resources through a variety of land restoration and regeneration measures had enabled other societies to flourish for centuries. He continues, in a very real sense, the land does not lie. It bears a record of what men write on it. In a larger sense, a nation writes its record on the land, and a civilization writes its record on the land, a record that is easy to read by those who understand the simple language of the land. This is very important and relevant information to consider because rapid growth in urbanization is causing increasingly more widespread land degradation, producing profound, far-reaching effects in the form of food and water scarcity, climate change, and threats to regional security and stability. Ultimately, if we are interested in reimagining cities as functionally sustainable spaces, quote unquote, we need to be clear about what makes them unsustainable to begin with, especially with cities being primarily industrial spaces. Quoting the American farmer and poet Wendell Berry, he states, if we are concerned about land abuse, then we must see that this is an economic problem. Every economy is by definition a land-using economy. If we are using our land wrongly, then something is wrong with our economy. This is difficult. It becomes more difficult when we recognize that in modern times, every one of us is a member of the economy of everybody else. But if we are concerned about land abuse, we have begun a profound work of economic criticism. Study of the history of land use, and any local history will do, informs us that we have had for a long time an economy that thrives by undermining its own foundations. Industrialism, which is the name of our economy and which is now virtually the only economy of the world, has been from its beginnings in a state of riot. It is based squarely upon the principle of violence toward everything on which it depends. And it has not mattered whether the form of industrialism was communist or capitalist or whatever. The violence toward nature, human communities, traditional agricultures, and local economies has been constant. The bad news is coming in literally from all over the world. So what are the basic essential needs of any and every human community? We need a continuous supply of uncontaminated water. Therefore, we need, among other things, soil and water conserving ways of agriculture and forestry that are not dependent on monoculture, toxic chemicals, or the indifference and violence that always accompany big-scale industrial enterprises on the land. Therefore, we need diversified, small-scale land economies that are dependent on people. Therefore, we need people with the knowledge, skills, motives, and attitudes required by diversified small-scale land economies. And all this is clear and comfortable enough until we recognize the question we have come to. Where are the people? Hopefully we'll discuss this as the panel discussion commences. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Remus. Next, I would like to invite to the podium our distinguished guest, Datuk Ismail Ibrahim. He's the Chief Executive of Iskandar Regional Development Authority in Malaysia. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Ismail to the podium.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure most of you in this room will be one way or another indirectly or directly responsible for the planning and the development of cities and regions. But what sometimes we fail to appreciate is that when we are tasked having to deal with growth and plans for cities and regions, we fail to actually define its purpose. Most of us, when we are tasked with that, we simply just draw up a plan and expect the plan just to take off. So this is vital and critical in any stage of the development and growth of cities and regions. So in the case of Iskandar, Malaysia, which is a region that is situated south of Peninsular Malaysia, measuring around 3 times the size of Singapore, at the very outset of its plan for the initiative, we have actually set out in great depth in trying to define and trying to work out what is it about Iskandar, Malaysia that we want to develop. So we have set certain targets from the way in which we want to see it develop from an economic perspective, right into this whole scenario of developing it from a sustainable point of view. But whatever it is, at the end of the day, we need to determine not only the purpose, but also the limitations of the resources that we have before us. Not every nation, not every region, not every city are rich and can have the luxury of resources. In the case of Malaysia, we are a developing country. Therefore, we need to work within the limited resources. Now, moving forward, we also need to see how all of this will interact with each other. And we need to really identify our stakeholders. Who are our stakeholders? In the case of Iskandar, Malaysia, our stakeholders are clearly defined as coming from 3 components. Number 1 is the government itself. Number 2 is the business community. And number 3 is the people. Now, again, we need to work out how these 3 components worked out with each other. And we need to devise a plan that would not only involve the government, but also how the government will interact with the business community and how at the end of the day, and that business community will bring benefit to the people. And this is the thing about having to describe. So meaning to say, when you draw out a plan, you need also to ensure that this plan is implementable within the limited resources that you have within you. Now, again, when we need to create development and growth, we need to find what are the limitations in terms of resources and build upon that. This is where we come to the process of creating what we meant by creating the right ecosystem for development. So again, in the case of Iskandar, we look at what are the constraints. For example, in the case of connectivity, we need to create the necessary infrastructure to give that level of connectivity not only to make sure that people are able to move seamlessly within this region, but also to make sure that how people and goods within this region is able to be connected to adjoining regions near and far. And having said that, having created that level of infrastructure, we need to also move on by monitoring how we implement that. Again, this is the failure of most planners and implementers, for the failure to monitor and to review the plans that have been formulated in the beginning. And for the failure to monitor, we have not been able to really measure what are or really the key success to things. So in summary, what I can say is that when we talk about the development and growth of cities and region, we must have a purpose, there must be a clear plan, there has to be implementation, and definitely there has to be a monitoring process, and finally there has to be a review. And if you don't go through that process, you may well likely fall into the trap of not being able to measure and to really achieve your target at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. For the next half an hour, we would like to have a discussion between the panelists. You can see we have master planners, we have revitalization, we have resource builders reinforcing and resourcing our cities. We have a lot of good opportunity here. What I have, and if we can go ahead and pull that slide up on the screen for everybody, is I've pulled together some pattern language for how Portland, Oregon has looked at sustainable planning for our cities. And pattern language basically is a means of giving common language to the structures that we choose, the building blocks that we use to talk about something with. So here there's 3 legs: ecology, economy, and equity, where equity refers to people of different cultures and classes having equal standing and access to social resources. So the question of the day is, how do we develop smart infrastructure for cities that preserve quality of life and holistic communities that are self-sustaining? I think I'd like to start that question with Mr. de Graaf.
I'm intrigued by the word equity, because, I mean, does that mean equality? And is that because equality is too charged a word these days, so it becomes equity? Because, I mean, equity in my dictionary means something different. But, I mean,
It's the hip new word in Portland that we're using, thank you, okay, to talk about equal access.
2 things. So it's about distribution of wealth.
It's about distribution of wealth, and it's also about racism and classism.
Okay. Well, then I think in that case, I can do nothing but endorse the diagram. And I don't know to what extent that serves the purposes of a discussion. But clearly, and this happens a lot in a discussion on sustainability, and I think it's also the inherent problem about a discussion of sustainability, because any discussion on sustainability is a little bit like a discussion on world peace. We all want it. Nevertheless, there seem to be inexplicable barriers between us and what we all crave for. I think, strangely enough, the devil is in the details, in a way, in ensuring that these 3 necessary categories become complementary phenomena rather than simply another example of contested territories, because it's clearly something everyone would agree with. Nevertheless, if tomorrow we move back to the order of the day, we quickly find one of the categories take an immediate priority, and that is the economy. And in as much as we're operating in a context of global competition, I think it's also inevitable that it does, because it's in a way the one category is a preconditions for the others to unfold. And here, I think in a market economy, in a globally competing world, you quickly move to the lowest common denominator and the slowest type of development that dictates, in a way, the progress towards the diagram.
So I'm going to invite the panelists to engage each other, not just me, because I want this to be a dialogue between us. I think that's where we'll get the most fruit. And again, this is just a pattern language for us to jump off of. I know, Mr. Ibrahim, in your presentation, you also had sort of a pattern language that you were using in your master planning. But here we're talking about, really the end goal of quality of life and holistic communities.
Thank you. My view is that when we talk about developing something that is smart, inclusive of infrastructure and whatnot, the thing that comes into mind is that smart shall not be limited only to the infrastructure. Whenever we talk about smart, there is always this perception that it is about technology, it is about infrastructure, and it is about software and all that. But you must also include at the same time the users, that is the people. So when we talk about smart infrastructure, you must have the right type of people or community to enable to use those so-called smart infrastructure smartly or efficiently, effectively. So sometimes there's always this gap where you introduce so much of this new infrastructure, technology, but the people are not ready or not able or not made aware or do not understand, and hence you are not able to achieve the very thing that you want to do.
And a fine example of that would be the esteemed architect William McDonough, who was hired by China to do these very visionary city plans China wanted to implement for their growth plan outside of Shanghai. And he did these visionary things where it continued to look like rolling hills, but another 50,000 people would live sort of underground and have these cities that still had beautiful light and a passageway, but the people weren't consulted, and it didn't fit their lifestyles, and it didn't fit their means. So a decade later, they remain unbuilt.
Well, I think one of the other things that has to be considered is what is the sort of the social and the economic context within which we're talking about these smart infrastructures, because what might be proposed for, say, a first world industrial economy is going to look very different than what you have in, say, in many portions of this part of the world. So, for example, places that are still largely sort of rural economies that really depend on a viable, productive resource base as far as land is concerned, they're going to have a very different set of criteria as to what is a smart infrastructure for that particular setting than, say, someone who's living in an industrial consumer economy. So, for example, I think we had talked about earlier, this in China, there was this great project that was funded by the World Bank called the Loess Plateau Watershed Rehabilitation Project. And the Loess Plateau is considered to be the cradle of Chinese civilization. It had been in use for something on the order of 6,000 years, but over the course of that long use, it had fallen out of production. There were a lot of problems with the area, chronic drought and flooding, famine, poverty. And then there was a huge amount of investment that was put into revitalizing the landscapes so that the people in this area were able to make use of the land again for primarily agricultural production. So you had 59% poverty that was cut to 27%, triple the incomes of the farmers, and you eliminate all of these really destructive environmental problems because the investment was actually in remediating the degradation that was in this area. So that was a great outcome, but it might look very different in, say, the U.S. or Holland or Canada. Again, the context is really important to consider.
I think one of the problems I've noticed is I don't think we don't know how to build good cities anymore. We had cities that actually worked for people. And ultimately, that's why cities were formed, where people came together, traded, discussed democracy. We now have cities that are dividing themselves. The reason we looked at the Australian cities is that they actually did a check of all the Australian cities, and they measured mortgage prices and petrol. And you see this distinct pattern of division of a city. In the inner area, people have access to everything. On the outer area, they have access to nothing. They spend an hour and a half in their cars going to work each day and an hour and a half coming back. You can see the violence. You can see, the breakdown of families. You can see the mortgage bankruptcies happening in those areas. We've got in Australia, although nobody wants to talk about it, a subprime market on the edge of our cities. So what are the ingredients of a good city? I mean, if we're talking about places for people, the ingredients, I think, if you want a social cohesion, you want economic viability, and you want a sustainability, first of all, cities need to have a certain density. And we're battling with density. Density is now equated with high-rise. It doesn't have to be high-rise. Barcelona is one of the densest cities in the world. It's 7 stories high. You need mixed use. You need to be able to share the infrastructure between all those uses over time so that you get more efficiency out of it. You need good connectivity. You need to be able to walk or take public transport through those areas. You need a high-quality public realm. We've got architects, and I am an architect, so I can say it, designing objects, not the spaces between buildings. It's become a competition of how beautiful a perfume bottle we can make. It's like perfume bottles on the shelves of supermarkets, rather than how they react to people. And the final thing is you need local character. You've got to build for your area, where you are in the world, not replicating someone else's character. If you can put those together, and that's what we've been endeavouring to do in our city, is to bring those things together, cities start to respond for people. We're copying Copenhagen. We've got 1% of our population in 2001 on bicycles coming to the city. We now have 13% coming to the centre of the city on bicycles. Sometimes they're very small moves. They're not big infrastructure. They're changing the culture of the way people use and see a city.
Thank you. And I'm curious, our two master planners here, Mr. Ibrahim or Mr. de Graaf, do you have a comment on that? Rob's talking about, Mr. Adams is talking about sort of revitalizing from the inside out and these essential ingredients of density, mixed use, and local character that really bring a city to life and make it useful. And when you're talking about planning and master planning from the top down, how would you relate to his comments?
The way I see, when you talk about the growth of cities and regions, and if you are responsible for it, directly or indirectly, it is actually talking about a journey. Whether it is talking about growth of 15 years, or 20 years, or 50 years, it is about a journey. A journey that is set at the outset and has a target to it. And you aspire to reach to that target. Now, when you are talking about sustainable growth and planning, that journey is actually more important than reaching the targets. Because if you fall out in any component within that journey, one, you will never be able to reach your target. And number two, you will be worse off than you started. So the journey is very important. Now, in order to ensure that that journey reaches its destination, you also need to build what I call as scenarios within the journey. At every stage of the journey, you must set little targets from which you are able to measure whether it is truly sustainable within your limited resources, or you need to tweak and you need to change and you need to review as you go along that journey. So my argument is that whilst you have a set target, you need to build that scenarios as you move along that journey in order for you to be able to ensure that as you build your building blocks, you are within the direction of growth or otherwise. Thank you.
Rainier?
Yeah, I'm wondering something. I was educated partially in the 70s and in the 80s. Partially in the 70s and the 80s. And I recall at the university that we disagreed quite a lot with each other. And something that is always very prevalent in these discussions is that there seems to be a remarkable consensus. A remarkable consensus on what we want, how we want to achieve it, etc., etc. So that simply leads me to think that there is something else between us and what we want that we are not discussing.
Excellent.
And I think what is a pity is that because you talk about perfume bottles that we shouldn't design, probably every architect, maybe few star architects not, but maybe every architect would agree with you. Nevertheless, there is a demand. There is an enormous demand for perfume bottles. And there, it is very strange that on the one hand architects discuss how bad perfume bottles are, on the other one they're the one profession incredibly complicit into designing them, simply because our profession has lost a complete critical dimension towards the political context in which it is operate. And when we agree mostly with each other. But I think it is very important that this discussion is taken to a whole other political level and also takes into account the governance and addresses the factors that actually compel us to perpetuate what we all think is wrong.
Yeah, I think once you get into the governance, you're actually starting to touch on the real issue. I mean, there are two things that interest me about governance and education. You go to university as an architect, and you leave school, you go to university, and you straight into designing buildings. It's a bit like if you were a medical student, the first thing you would do would be brain surgery. You just left out general practice. Our education as architects doesn't have a base in the cities, and most of us are now practicing the cities. Yet very few of us understand the cities. Most practitioners will call themselves urban designers. I would argue the general public are better urban designers than we are. They intuitively know whether a place is a good place or a bad place. But we've trained ourselves away from understanding the qualities of cities. And we need to reintroduce into our education that base level understanding of cities, then go on to specialize as a landscape architect or as an architect or as a quantity surveyor or as an engineer. I'd make the same comment about government. So I never thought I'd work in a government, and I've been there for 30 years now. The thing that I've discovered is that governments have de-skilled themselves. We are no longer intelligent clients. We have contracted out our intellect in the hope that we could actually make government cheaper. And what we're now left with is risk managers, and we haven't got the people who can actually understand or write the contracts that we need to get the stuff that will actually make our cities better places. So I think we've got a real problem, both in the structure of our governments and in the structure of our education. And I think this is something we need to look at very carefully.
But I think also one of the things that helps, at least in trying to focus the design vision, is I think certain settings, certain design contexts, I think force us to be a bit more honest about what it is that we propose design-wise. I think again in a lot of the first world, a lot of the rich countries that have the ability to basically bridge the shortfalls in how cities are provisioned, how they're serviced, they have a bit more sort of creative license. They can stand to bear the consequences of bad design. Right, you just spend a lot of money on something. But unfortunately, I think we've gotten into the habit of taking bad design and papering over it with high technology and calling that good design. And that's not what good design is. And you learn that very quickly, say, when you come to a region like, say, the Middle East or North Africa or the Gulf, or in other places that don't necessarily have much in the way of resources or infrastructure. And then the climate, the physical place is really calling for you to have to think. And we had some involvement with the Masdar City project down in Abu Dhabi, and this whole idea of sustainability, which is that project is supposed to embody, really forces us to think, given the constraint that they had, the design goal. So they wanted to be a carbon neutral, zero emission city. And so the outcome of how to meet that goal is going to look very specific. So it's not necessarily about having creative license and making something look very pretty. You have to actually put something together that works properly. And we need more projects that are defined in that manner, because if it is defined according to function, then it's going to have a very specific appearance. It's not just a
place-specific answers with function.
I'm sorry?
Place-specific answers.
Absolutely, absolutely. It has to be context-specific in order for the design to make sense, and and it's not just sort of a vain pursuit.
Thank you.
From my point of view, if you look at the world today, there are three types of countries or nations. The first group is the underdeveloped. The second group is the developing. The third group is the developed. Now, for each of these groupings of countries, the way in which government govern definitely has to be different. In my view, for countries that is underdeveloped, there is this famous phrase that says, govern for the people. There has to be a lot of government intervention in order to bring the country into some level of prosperity. Now, the second group is where the country is developing. There is always this famous phrase that is termed as governing with the people. So the government involves the people in driving the growth of as society progress in terms of knowledge, then the government will give in and try to bring society to plan and grow together. Now, in a developed country, the government tends to use this phrase, governed by the people. The people and the community will decide for themselves how the country is to be growing, how the country is to be managed, and how even the country is to be run. The government takes a back seat. So I think this is very important when it comes to use and development of land. We need to look within the context of each region, within the context and framework of each nation, so that government will know what would be the right level of intervention for each of these situations. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a note that in about 15 minutes, I'll be inviting questions from the audience. I chose some of these pictures to go with this particular question about what land use, government policies, or incentives do you think are most important to consider in planning, retrofitting, or revitalizing to make holistic communities. Because this one on the right with the outline of the city sort of reminded me of Rome, where you have the Colosseum and you have this design of a city that has a footprint that was made hundreds of years ago, and yet that still is the shape that the city is designed around. And so, you know, as you are urban planners and you make a decision, this building's going to go here, these monuments are going to go here, it leaves an imprint, it leaves an impact. And so, yeah, just the impact of that, and perhaps the next slide may even speak to that a little bit more. When we talk about city planning over time, the impact of your decisions.
The image on the right, on the previous slide, is actually Milan. It's a very interesting, I know the picture very, very well. It's a very interesting picture. This is a housing development shortly after the war when Italy suffered massive unemployment and a housing shortage, and in a way, out of two problems, a single solution emerged, where in a way the unemployed became construction workers and created housing for the masses. Whatever you think of it, and whatever you think of 1950s or 60s architecture, this is a remarkable social endeavor of a government fixing a problem with a degree of decisiveness that in the West we seldom see. The church in the middle is the San Giovanni Bono by Arrigo Arrighetti, who was an architect who is not famous, who produced a masterpiece with that church, and all of his life he worked for government. He never had his own practice. He never practiced with any recognition. He worked in a kind of dusty municipal department for most of his life, producing excellent work. And in that sense, when we look at cities, and even when we look at a picture from the 50s like that, it's enormously important to think or to realize that not everything is what it seems, and it's enormously important to realize the social context which actually produced, which is now part of our history.
Thank you.
I think the interesting thing about that when I look at it, and I agree with you about, the social context it grew up in, but as a place for living, most of those have actually failed. And they fail because what they have taken away is the most important ingredient of a city, and that's the street. A street makes up 80% of the public space of a city. And if you want to have a one-liner, if you design a good street, you design a good city. You think of the cities you enjoy walking around and visiting and staying in, it's usually about the street. What is happening with a lot of these estates, and I don't know this one in particular.
Well, this one is actually an interesting exception to what you're raising.
Okay.
Because it started as social housing. It is phenomenally successful. It's one of the most popular neighborhoods in Milan. Its social housing was actually sold at record prices, even surpassing some of the private housing that has been built since. The church is meanwhile part of Italy's national heritage. And I realize that for a lot of 50s and 60s neighborhoods, of course, you're completely right. Only, unfortunately, the picture we're looking at is an exception to the rule.
Because most of them have been demolished. Oh. And most of them are actually, if they haven't been demolished, they're infilling the fabric to bring back the fabric of the surrounding neighborhood, to actually inject people back into it.
If I may refer to actually a compelling historical example, because I think sometimes when we talk about cities, it seems like the discussion is often ahistorical. And as if sort of many of the best innovations either haven't been developed yet or there's nothing to refer back to. And interestingly enough, being that we're at the World Islamic Economic Forum, some of the best examples come out of the Muslim world. And interestingly enough, the Muslims' presence in Southern Europe. If you go to Al-Andalus, I had a good fortune of being there about a month or two ago. There's a great book written by someone named G.T. Wrench, Dr. G.T. Wrench, called Reconstruction by Way of the Soil. And he points out in that book that during the time that the Muslims were in Spain, at one point the population of Spain was 30 million. It was 30 million, and which was more than the four most populous countries of Europe at the time. So we're talking about England, France, Italy, and Germany. They had maybe between 15 to 20 million when you aggregate the population of those four countries. Now, it begs the question, what was happening in that place that allowed them to support a population that large? And what's great is you can still go back to lots of these places in southern Spain and see elements of the design of these communities, which gives you clues as to sort of what worked. And it's been working for centuries. I mean, in some cases over 1,000 years. Being that the Muslims first showed up there in the early 8th century. So.
And what are those design elements?
Well, I mean, it began with the design of landscape. Interestingly enough, there's a beautiful project that a gentleman I know named Simon Fitzwilliam Hall has been working on the publishing of translations of a group of texts called the Filaha Text Project, and it's a book. It's a collection of ancient texts that had been written which are essentially texts of jurisprudence about how to manage land, how to design land. And there's a famous book called Kitab al-Filaha, the book of agriculture, or the book of land husbandry, that was written by a scholar from Sevilla named Ibn al-Awam. And the funny thing is, lots of the cutting-edge sustainable design ideas are actually, that are now current, are actually contained in this text. So it's a perfect example of sort of what's old is new again. Yeah. And it's a beautiful opportunity to sort of revitalize or revive this knowledge, because we're now at a point where lots of these approaches need to be re-implemented, and with some new insights, because we have we live in the information age. That we have insights into lots of different elements that are of course included in these texts. But it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to access these really long-lived successful strategies from the past and bring them into the present and hopefully clear a path to the future.
I would like to throw this argument by saying that these ideas about the development of towns and cities, as most planners have learned in planning schools for hundreds of years, actually is still the same. There is no new approach and methodology in terms of dealing with use and development of land. Why do I say that? Because in all of the methodology of approaching to use and development of land, there are always two things that will happen, whether you realize it or not. Number one, in dealing with use and development of land, in planning, there is always this element of stereotyping. At the outset, you would accept that there are going to be different level of society's income. And you start to chart out your land in accordance with the way in which the household incomes are. This is the housing scheme for the poor, this is for the middle class, this is for the rich and affluent. That is not the way in which we should be dealing with use and development of land today. If you are talking about equitable distribution of resources, if you are talking about wanting to spread wealth equitably, if you're talking about wanting to ensure that there is inclusiveness, that has to be reflected in the way in which we plan our cities and regions. And if you don't approach in that manner, you are as if accepting takdir, and you do your plan in accordance with your projected growth. So this is, I think, a challenge that has to be taken by planners and architects and designers in coming up with new approaches. And I think in Islam, we have been demanded, there is a demand for us to look at this element of inclusiveness, and we have to deal it accordingly in the way in which we plan our cities and region.
Thank you. So on this question, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that building cities and revitalizing, there's a lot of capital that's involved in doing this. And so I want to talk about the resources invested in the buildings and the infrastructure, and sort of play between these two questions in our last few minutes before we open it up to questions. Government incentives, buildings lasting over time, the amount of money that's invested in urban planning and city planning, even if we're doing the smart planning that Rob is talking about, where we're doing incremental long-term movement towards a goal over time. What type of incentives do we need? What do we need to look at for time-based resiliency in our urban planning today?
There's an interesting study that we did in Melbourne, and I know Melbourne is a particular city type. It's a suburban city. It's got a central core, and then it's low density. What we discovered is that if we actually put a ring around the city and didn't expand it, and I talked about bringing an extra 4 million people in, that for every 1,000 houses we built back in the existing city, it would save us $300 million in infrastructure over 50 years.
That's impressive.
So if you equate that from going from 4 to 8 million, that's $440 billion that you would save if you actually changed the way you built the city. So imagine what you could use that money for in terms of education, schooling, equity, affordable
Healthcare.
housing, sustainability. I think one of the challenges for us is to stop thinking about infrastructure and the cost of infrastructure in the way that we did in the 20th century. We need to actually start thinking differently about it. And incentives can work. I mean, the Australian government is not famous at the moment for being enlightened about the environment. But what the previous government did was actually say 20% renewable by 2020. That target and a small incentive has now reduced the electricity demand to such an extent that they are able to start closing down power stations. That's why the current government is so upset with it, because their constituency runs power stations. So I think very small moves and setting of targets is really important. And the incentive might be important, but I think the target is more important. If you can set a target, people have a pride in actually meeting that target. Whether it's 20% renewable, we had 155 litres per person per day when we had a drought, everybody hit that target.
It gives some people something to work towards, or work together towards.
Well, it contextualizes the problem for them. Our problems are so vast. If you talk about climate change, you get that dull feeling on the back of your head. If you talk about climate change in a city, you suddenly think, we can save water, we can plant trees, we can reduce our use of motor cars, we can use public transport. It becomes a manageable context. And I think that's what we've got to do.
Thank you.
If I can, I'd like to go back to the example from Spain, because just to talk about some of the features that had given it such really great longevity. And Spain's it's not the only example, but I want to go back to some of the points I was making in the beginning with the importance of being able to produce the things that provision the city from within the city limits. So, for example, we really do have to think about the need to produce food, be able to retain water, as Rob was also indicating. But I wanted to take the food equation, or the food portion in particular. If you look at what it costs in terms of energy to feed cities within industrial settings, industrial economies, right now the energy budget is something on the order of, it basically takes about 15 to 20 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food.
So there's a deficit there, there's a loss.
So it's absurdly inefficient. But the problem is that the inefficiency is incentivized because, say, in my country, in America, in our country, in America, it's subsidized.
Right.
It's subsidized by the government. And then the funny thing is that most of the people that are able to get the subsidies aren't farmers. They're Wall Street people. Right. So, and so because, there's this huge aggregation of capital that is involved with producing that particular item, the problem never gets addressed because people are able to get a lot of money for it. And then to go back to my opening remarks, this is the reason why civilizations fail historically. And it happens over and over and over and over again. And as we've become more and more technologically oriented, and cities have gotten farther and farther away from the things that actually provision them, this problem is getting worse and worse, faster and faster. So until we start addressing a lot of those issues, then we're gonna be in a very, very serious bind. And we've already gotten indications of what that might look like on events that happen here, right here in the region, in the Middle East, North Africa, Gulf region, with a lot of the speculation in food futures. So that's one of the things that I believe we really need to take a closer look at.
In Portland, Oregon, we have maybe not incentives, but we have so much in terms of trying to move people towards smart buildings and energy efficiency. I'm not sure if it would be quite an incentive. Sometimes the developers feel like it's regressive because it's so demanding of their resources to meet those environmental goals, that sometimes they feel like they do need an incentive to be able to do that. So we've created a business tax credit that comes back to the developers to incentivize them to actually do this type of forward-thinking eco building. So that's another place that I'm looking to go with this question. Any comments on that? Thoughts? Well, at this point, we could move into questions from the audience if we'd like to. Are there questions from the audience? Up here in the front, this gentleman here. And then second over here. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yes?
Good afternoon. My question is regarding the smart city infrastructure that you guys have been describing. And my question is, how important do you believe resource management is by the people? Because the information that the people get is very, very light. Mr. Abraham earlier was mentioning the fact that he believes people need more information. They need to be informed. They need to be aware. But how can people be aware when the only people that have the information are the people that control the resources and the distribution of that? What is the panel's opinion on this?
May I take that first, Sarah? Because I have a very strong opinion
Sure.
about this. I think this gets into sort of socioeconomic context. If you come from, again, a first world country, which you know, the economy is entirely based on consumer spending. Your job isn't to know where these things come from. Your job is to take $1, put it down on the counter, purchase this item, right, and then go home, and then use it, and then go back to the counter and buy another one. So, again, your function is to not be responsible for right now, presently. You're not incentivized to be responsible for the things that you use. And I think, to your point, that's one of the things that we do need to do sort of collectively as a society, or as human societies, is actually become responsible for the things that we use. Because we don't produce the food that we eat, we don't produce the fiber that makes, the thread that makes our clothes, we don't produce the materials that builds our housing. You buy all of that stuff from somewhere that's really remote and far away, and then the bad effects of those things are localized in one location, and then all of the benefits, the financial benefits, are aggregated in another. And this is a problem. But I think that's a harder dilemma to solve, because now you have to address people's behavior. You have to address people's behavior. And people don't change unless they have to.
One of the things that I've found, one of my other hats is I'm an energy manager, and there have been studies that show in universities where they place monitors that give feedback to an apartment residence in a dormitory or a planned living center, where they give feedback to how much energy they're using and give them goals, like you're talking about, Rob, that people begin to modify in alignment with those goals, and especially when they're able to see what their neighbors are doing and what the trend is. And there's a lot of peer competition there, or peer, bringing up to the level, wanting to be, as we say in the United States, be like the Jones. And that comes even to doing the good things of saving energy or other, as you were speaking about.
I think you ask a very valid question. When we were talking earlier about, governance and, for the people, by the people, etc. One of the early experiences I had was in squatter settlements in Zimbabwe, where I was born. And the interesting thing, one of my heroes at that time was a guy called John Turner, who had worked in the favelas and the barrios, and he talked about housing by the people, not for the people. And in the study we did of a place called Chirambahoyo, just outside Harare, where squatters had settled on a pre-planned piece of land, so they didn't have a lot of the problems associated with marginal land and drainage, the people themselves were building entirely functional houses for $175 each. Because they were making sun-dried bricks, they were using, beaten out metal as roofs, and the climate in Zimbabwe is particularly mild. The government was producing them at 5,000. So pick the difference between whether you want a mortgage of $5,000 or you want to spend $176. And the empowerment of the people by being involved is quite important. Take that to a modern context. When that slide I showed earlier, the drought or climate change hit Melbourne and our lakes got down to below 20%, the government actually restricted water to 155 litres per person. It was a matter of pride that you got below that. And people started to talk about how they were saving water, how they were actually taking the water from the bath and putting it on the garden, putting in grey water systems, putting in rainwater tanks. You know, some of the simple technologies that we all understood but have sometimes been outlawed by regulations. Maybe a rainwater tank because you get malaria if you've got mosquitoes. But there's ways of dealing with that. So I actually think with the communications we've got today, if we can actually tell people what the problem is, they will become the energy that actually solves that problem. Yeah. Solar panels are taking the peak off our electricity in Australia. 1 million households have put solar panels in, when the government actually, in many cases, condemn them as a mini technology. But in fact, they're actually solving a huge problem for us. So I think there is this awareness of the public that we don't give them credit for. And once we actually provide them with the technology where they can go out and do it themselves, they will go out in great numbers and do it. So solar panels have dropped from 15,000 for a 2.5 kilowatt array to $1,500 for 1.5, because people just started using more of them.
Excellent.
Was this actually your question? Because, I mean, I picked up on something else, which I think is very relevant when we talk about smart cities and the digital. You spoke about a city that relies on the initiative of people, so they make prudent use of resources, when actually the information is in the hands of those who control the resources, which in a way is, again, a very political phenomena, in as much as the fair unfolding of good governance relies on the separation of powers. We have the digital at this moment being on a very dubious side of history, and it can go either way, and it's very early days on saying which way it'll go, because I mean there are signs that the digital is on the side of monopolizing information, and there are signs that the digital is actually an interesting subversion of monopolies on information. And I think one of the most interesting discussions to be had in the smart city is to actually look which way that coin is going to fall, and to ensure that it falls the right way, because the digital has an interesting double track record. It's on the side of the monopoly and it subverts it. So I think a part of our job as planners is to make sure that it subverts emerging monopolies in the name of all the good things that you are describing indeed unfolding.
Just one last point. This just quickly came to mind. In sort of financial economic terms, given the current measure of what accounts for sort of beneficial economic activity, if you produce the things that you consume, you don't add anything to GDP. If you produce the things you consume, you actually don't contribute anything to the economy. And yet, this is actually part of what needs to happen if we are to create smart cities. Is that people actually have to start producing the things they consume, or at the very least, if they produce the things they consume within the locations that they live, at least, you know, you're actually able to generate some kind of localized economic engine. But it doesn't rely on this huge sort of globalized monster where, again, things are made in one place and they're purchased and consumed in another. And that's a whole nother ball of wax.
This is a truly brilliant statement, actually.
It's an entirely different ball of wax.
Sorry? You want me to say that in the microphone?
Yeah.
I said, or I whispered, this is a truly brilliant statement. That apparently there is some systemic imperative in our current economic system that is in the way of sustainability.
Yeah.
Thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead to our second question over here. Do we have a microphone there? And then from this gentleman, the following question will be in the back of the room.
My name is Iftikhar Ali. My question is, an observation was made that the housing that is being created today is for three kind of people: the affluent and the rich, the middle class, and the people who are just there, who live either below the poverty line or are just existing. How do you mitigate this situation? Because the three categories of people would always be different, with their wealth perspective, with their education perspective, with their knowledge of new ideas of building. Second part is, I have lived in Milan for a long time, and while the Duomo is supposed to be a wonderful piece of architecture, the adjoining streets that are in the buildings, high-rise buildings, are so congested that even you can't park your Fiat car there at night.
So
How
it's a
do you
very
explain this?
sustainable city because it drives back the use of cars preemptively.
Yes, low pollution.
Things should be within walking distance, indeed. So your
It
question,
inspires
sir?
walking.
My question is, how do you mitigate these situations where, on the one hand, you are creating three classes of society? Because there was a report of the United Nations that the gap between the rich and the poor in the finest economy of the world, which is the United States, had never been greater in 100 years than what it is today. So what are the mitigating circumstances that you can reduce the risk of this great divide?
Thank you. I think I'll respond to that since I made that observation. And thank you. I had half expect that question to come from the floor, coming from my observation just now. But in any case, the point that I'm trying to put across here is that as planners and designers and even architects, we should not accept the way things are based on trends and projection. There has to be a further form of intervention. Okay, let's say based on trend, there are going to be three segments of household income. Now, under normal circumstances, you would immediately say you need three clusters of houses. But have you not thought further by saying, why not I get rid of these people with the lowest income by creating opportunities for them to increase their household income or wealth, by creating opportunities for them to enter into employment, by creating opportunity for them to enter and create business. Hence, over a long term or mid-term, and that's what I call sustainability, you are able to rid of this putting society in terms of silos, and by tackling the bigger picture rather than dealing with the immediate. So if you look across not only in housing, in other things that you deal with, you can actually, if you look further, should be able to solve this problem of simply looking at how we plan things in the immediate rather than in the future.
I think as far as the situation in the United States is concerned, this wealth gap that exists, I think it speaks largely to the way the economy has shifted over the course of most of the 20th century. The city I always use as an example is Detroit. Detroit, Michigan, I don't know how many people are aware, but Detroit, Michigan, well, at one point it was the crown jewel of American industrialization. As of July of last year, it is the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States. So how do you go from, and this is the city that gave birth to the American middle class, the whole, I'm going to buy a house and send my kid to college and you're going to be upwardly mobile. I mean, it is literally, I went there for the first time 4 years ago, and I grew up in New York, and we had always heard about how crazy Detroit was, and it was before kind of the recent downturn, and I was shocked at what I saw, and I think there's a cautionary tale in looking at Detroit from the standpoint of, I think, urban design, but also in terms of the larger commentary that it makes on the nature of our economies, is that city is the emblem for what happens to places that were formerly based on industrial economic activity. And then the moment you find cheaper labor, You take that activity and you go somewhere else. And then the people that aren't able to get out, they don't have enough money or they don't have the wherewithal to get out of the city, they're stuck. And that's exactly what you see, not only in Detroit, but a lot of the Rust Belt cities in the United States.
Anybody else on this? Okay. We have a question from the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Moinuddin Monem. I'm from Bangladesh. First of all, let me compliment. I mean, I myself and the families in a construction business, we are in Bangladesh for the last 50 years. And I'm absolutely thrilled and intrigued by the discussions that you personally has intrigued and brought them to bear to share the knowledge. And I grew up in US, in Boston, and I can really, Brother Ibrahim, you took me back to my hometown. But what I like to pose a very simple question. I see the challenges when I gone back to Bangladesh as a developing country. The challenge lies, we build roads in different parts of the country. We may say almost, I would say 20% road was built by our company in Bangladesh, in the most of the highways I talk about. And I have seen the areas, how they have grown when you build the roads. But the biggest challenge we see today in a developing country is the concept that recently the Indian president, he visited Bangladesh, the previous president of India, Dr. Abul Kalam, and we share the same view that was, how do you provide the urban amenities to the rural areas? I mean to say, you talked about the rural development, fine, but not to mention that 75 to 80% people live in the rural areas in developing countries. The challenge lies with us that how do we develop the rural areas that has similar amenities or close to the amenities that have the urban areas have, and you provide the same facilities, municipal facilities, the school, college, school, all the things that you talk about, and how to take those challenges going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may respond to that question, sir. I think if you look at any city or region, the first rule is never to look at it inwardly. You have to look out and to be sensitive about other regions and other cities. Because in today's age, you cannot look at yourself in isolation, be it a city, even a nation. You have to be sensitive surrounding. Because from that awareness and understanding on how you look at yourself, then you would be able to chart out several initiatives that would be able to solve some of the issues that you face. One way is to create partnerships, because cities need each other, region needs each other to grow. In the case of Iskandar, for instance, we grow together with Singapore as another region. We cannot be on our own because we share talents, we create partnership, business to business, even people to people. So the way forward is to create partnership and to work from that. And secondly, is definitely to work out on what I term as connectivity. Connectivity here is important. It's not about only the hardware of connectivity, but also the software of connectivity. I've been in several countries that are developing, but the way in which they create that connectivity might not necessarily be the likes of a developed cities. So we should not necessarily aspire to develop cities that is connected by high-end type of mass rapid transit, because we know that our resources are limited. But as long as we are able to create that connectivity based on effectiveness and efficiency of those modes of transportation, then we will be able to achieve our mission. And along the way, through this partnership, and by looking at ourselves outwardly instead of inwardly, we should be able to chart our program and our future slowly but surely, and at the end of the day, sustainably.
Did you want to address that? No? Okay. Well, I think that's going to go ahead and conclude our session today. We've had a beautiful review looking at some of the things that we've brought out. Rob spoke about the value of planning with density, mixed use, so that you have a shared mixed use, really bringing the vitalization of a city together, so that when people are walking down a street or they're in the common areas, you have that vital economy that you, sir, from Bangladesh, were just asking about. How do you really bring that out in an area, and that you really bring that local character, which is something that City Repair really looks at too. Governing for the people, with the people, and looking at provisioning a city with the food and water resources, contextualizing a problem, giving the real goals, by giving it real goals to aim towards. And I just want to ask, is there a last word from any panelists that you want to just, anybody want to tie anything down before we end?
Yeah, I don't think the problem's not technical.
The problem's not technical.
The creating smart cities is not a technical problem. We know
the technology,
what has to be done.
Answers.
The problem invariably is people. Is how can you get everybody on the same page? And I think Rob had, I think, indicated that from the governance standpoint, or trying to relate between the design and people that are going to implement the design from government level. Just having people be able to sit down and communicate and agree that, these goals make sense. This is going to get us all, collectively closer to where we want to be. And I think ultimately that is really what we have to become better at. It's not the technical things. It's how do we integrate and really bring the ideas that come from a whole host of parties together to move everything forward.
Any other closing remarks?
I'll give a closing remark. Rapid urbanisation is one of the most positive things in the world today. It is actually one of the guaranteed growth areas, unlike many of the other economic things. When people move to cities, their families get smaller. If we're going to get the population of the globe under control, the best contraception is urbanisation.
Certainly.
I think our governments at national levels need to start thinking about the economy of cities and getting good results out of it. When I go to the World Economic Forum in 10 days' time, I can guarantee you that cities will not be on the agenda at Davos. I've been there for 5 years, and it's difficult to get cities on the agenda. I can't work out why national governments have not realised the importance of cities and their economies. They will help us solve the problems of climate change, social inequity, and social cohesion, as well as economic vitality.
One, what you're saying I really want to emphasize too is that when people move to urban centers, their family size go down, which is really an antidote to the problem of overpopulation that can erase some of the other good efforts that we make. So thank you for drawing that out. Any other closing remarks?
We have to accept the fact that urbanization will continue to happen, and it will pose new challenges for nations and cities and regions. So my take is that we need to continue this dialogue process. I think this dialogue process would enhance our way and awareness of and our understanding of cities and regions. And through that, we should be able to share the experience and solve new challenges as they come by. Thank you.
Thank you.
No comment.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And that'll conclude our session.